Maya is the long-suffering, financially generous eldest daughter working overseas. Her parents and younger sister covertly sell Maya's downtown condo, forging her signature to fund Sasha's extravagant wedding. Maya discovers both the fraud and that she's been anonymously paying the family's debts for years through a holding company. Instead of quietly covering losses, she fights back, files legal actions, freezes the sale, exposes the family's debts and lies to vendors and the public. The fallout ruins Sasha's wedding, destroys family reputation, and leads to criminal charges for the parents. Maya ends estranged but liberated, choosing herself over a parasitic family. They sold me like a used thing. Not one of them paused. The screen lit my hotel room in Shanghai, a quarter-inch of frost on the glass, a soft hum of air conditioning, the small rectangle where my mother's face bloomed with a practiced sweetness. Maya, darling, we have good news. The words should have been ordinary. Instead, they were the exact tone of a hand closing. I let the smile come out of habit, the one I practiced on conference calls and family dinners, the smile that obliges. What's happened? I asked. My desk chair creaked. Outside, the city was a jagged heartbeat of light. They told me my downtown apartment had been sold. I felt a dark, physical thing drop behind my ribs. It wasn't the money, not really. It was the weight of a place that lived as evidence, my name on a deed, the box of first-edition novels on the shelf, the tiny kitchen where I'd learned to cook under fluorescent light. It was where I had proven I could build something for myself. They had turned that fact into cash while they smiled at the camera. Family helps family, my father said, like a mask that had never fit quite well. My sister laughed in the background, breathless with a dress of light. It's for the wedding, Maya. Gabriel and I picked the grand view. She didn't say your or mine, the pronouns slid over ownership like oil. The screen broke into motion, my name on the deed, apparently irrelevant. When I asked how they had handled the paperwork, their answers were honeyed and small. We took care of it. You weren't using it. It was practical. When I asked if they'd forged my signature, the room rotated and my mother's face took on the injured look she reserves for being corrected. Who says that? She breathed. I held the phone away and watched the skyline refract in the dark glass of my laptop. I had been living in sterile rental rooms for months, building a trajectory in spreadsheets and late-night flights. I had been the invisible benefactor, always the one to say yes when the family called, and yet they imagined that the life I carved for myself could be traded without asking. When the call ended, I did not yell. Instead, I practiced the thing I do best, inventory. Deeds, contracts, the corporate shell set up 3 years earlier, Meridian holdings, quiet clauses, and offshore accounts I'd created at the edges of my life to keep things clean. The apartment had been moved into Meridian's name months after purchase. My hands remembered the keystrokes, the dates, the little confirmations you get when legal paperwork clicks shut. There was a small, perverse pleasure in being better prepared than their theft. Not relief, that would be a false word, but clarity. I could see the path from their friendly faces to the papers recording their lie. That clarity tasted like cold metal. On a sleepless bed, I opened my messages and found Kinley's contact like a flare. Her answer came before I could finish the question. Tell me everything. She has the hands of a litigator and the temper of a friend who won't let you self-destruct. It was the perfect combination. I told her, and in the telling the story stopped being private and started being a plan. By morning the first thread of dominoes had been nudged. A wedding planner's name in my inbox, payment processing issues. 3 vendor emails with the same pointed phrasing. My parents' group chat lighted like an emergency. They had already spent the money. They had written themselves checks against it. In the thin daylight, a new feeling settled under my skin, the cold, bright priority of action. I was going to stop a sale, but the thing I wanted most wasn't to reclaim a building keyed to my name. It was to make them look up and truly see what they had done. Not for vengeance alone, but to test if anything about that family was salvageable. The test, I suspected, would be brutal. The details came like splinters, small, sharp, impossible to ignore. Kinley read the deed in 30 seconds, and then closed her laptop with a click that sounded like a gavel. Meridian owns the title, she said. They transferred it legally months ago. Your parents sold something they did not have the right to sell. It's fraud. Legal facts settle in the body differently than emotions. Facts fit into ballots and boxes, names, dates, signatures. Emotions are ragged, they sear. Mine braided the two together, a ledger of what had been taken and a raw, personal loss of trust. That afternoon, I compiled a list: the original deed, bank statements, the Meridian transfer confirmation, screenshots of the family chat where they discussed deposits and venue prices like they were picking a color scheme. I mapped every payment Meridian had made on their behalf, a small, regular stamp into their mortgage account, the occasional payoff for credit cards, the ghost line to Sasha's tuition. I'd been buying them time without asking for gratitude, because the silence from home felt safer than the conversation that would follow if I'd been explicit about the help. There was a grotesque symmetry now. They had been spending what my silence and my shell company had bought, then sold what they assumed was theirs to fund a display. The realization gave me a strange calm. People like to say burn it down as a metaphor. I was not intending pyrotechnics. I was intending clarity, a legal, public light that would expose this architecture of dependence. Kinley moved as if she had anticipated the choreography of this moment for a long time. She filed an injunction the following morning. The judge's clerk required the documents, the affidavit, the proof of forged signatures. Kinley's hands flew from file to file. We get a temporary restraining order, she told me, and the bank freezes the proceeds. Vendors get notices. That's enough to stop them from spending more. In the family group chat, the messages turned from celebration to confusion. My sister posted floral mood boards at noon and then frantic texts by evening. Florist says checks bounced. I watched the thread, a voyeur to their unraveling. My mother's messages shifted beneath the surface, pleading gifts, then thin-lipped excuses. My father's syntax shortened. His voice messages became clipped fragments. The vendors called. The wedding planner begged. The band requested immediate payment. The Grandview sent a formal notice, full payment within 48 hours or the date is released. Panic sank in like wet fabric. The wedding, once triumphant and dreamlike, started to look like a house of cards. Yet panic is a cognitive mirror. People looked outward for blame. My parents claimed a banking delay. Sasha frantically positioned herself as the victim of an unknown financial sabotage and posted videos of her tearful rehearsal dinners. The internet began to collect her pain as spectacle. The smell of cheap sympathy spread. It made me sick. I could have stepped in then, released a conciliatory email, restored the funds, and unbent everything. It would have saved the wedding, kept my parents' reputations, and probably kept the family intact. The calculus, though, had shifted. Every favor I had granted had been stripped of consent. The sale was a violation of law and of 100 small promises. I was tired of being the default fix for other people's mistakes. So I leaned into the legality of it. Kinley, injunction. Me. A carefully worded message to the vendors outlining the fraud, attached documentation, and a polite distance. I started sending the records to the people who needed to know: the venue, the florist, the caterer, the wedding planner who had trusted a deposit that evaporated. Some opened the files and called. Others emailed back with, "We appreciate this notice, and we will proceed accordingly." The story accelerated. Journalists sniffed a scandal. The intersection of money, family, and fraud is irresistible. Sasha's manic Instagram videos were clipped and reposted with headlines that framed her as a tragic bride. My parents called their acquaintances. They tried to save dignity with borrowed phrases. "We made a mistake" reads differently than "we forged a signature," and I waited to see whether they could look at the difference. Late one night, when the city lights made a soft horizon beyond my hotel window, a voicemail played from Dad, a brittle plea for reconciliation. I listened to his voice saying, "We're family, Maya. This is what families do." The recording did not make him right. It only made him human and, simultaneously, culpable. That night, I realized the battle was no longer only legal. It was a moral reckoning that would extend beyond our kitchen table conversations into public record. I had to prepare not only my legal file, but the story I would tell the world. If I told it cleanly, without spectacle, it would stick. If I let someone else narrate our family, they would flatten it into a meme. I chose the cleaner path, the record, the receipts, the truth. The twist was not a dramatic explosion. It was quieter and worse. The discovery that my supposed generosity was not only the thing that kept them afloat, it was also the single lever they could no longer pull without permission. In paragraphs of Bank Ledger Light, the story revealed a deeper theft. My parents had tried to extract loans using my name. They had been testing how far they could push illusions. Amara, the loan officer, told me by video call what the bank records already suggested. Applications in my name. Attempts to borrow against the apartment months before the sale. A pattern of escalating, quiet fraud that complemented the overt one they'd committed on the deed. The family's scramble had been longer than I had thought. They weren't improvising. They'd been rehearsing. The revelation changed my moral map. It made the injunction feel not just necessary, but urgent. They had been building a house of theft and assumption. In me, the person who had been generous and strategic, they had found a resource they could treat as inexhaustible. The knowledge made my hands go still, then steady. There is a sharpness that comes with being underestimated. People assume you'll fold. I had learned how to fold myself to survive. Now I opted to stand. When the bank froze the funds, the first vendor emails began cascading into my inbox. Venue holds, flower deposits, caterers' cancellation notices. The wedding planner sent one message that read less like business and more like grief. "Everything's collapsing," she wrote. "We can't deliver what's been promised." She was Collateral, a small entrepreneur whose entire calendar had been leveraged on their word. Her panic felt, for a second, indistinguishable from Sasha's. Only it was true pain, economic fallout, not curated sorrow. The midpoint twist, however, was Xander's call. He had been quiet, an outsider experiencing the family like glass, reflective, brittle. He told me what I suspected, but had not expected. His circle had smelled smoke for months. Old money networks can sniff impropriety. Their advisors flagged my family as risky. Once they dug, they found not only a suspicious sale, but patterns of unpaid debts and social inertia. He was pulling his family away and, in the same breath, offering me a map. "If this continues," he said softly, "it will end the engagement." When Xander's voice faded, so did the image Sasha had of her future. The wedding that had been designed as the coronation of her life began to look like exposure. The ring that signified reunion became an exit route. She reacted as most people react when their narrative collapses, lashing outward, clinging inward. She posted a long, breathy reel calling me a saboteur, and the internet obliged, slicing her grief into bite-sized outrage. There was another, personal twist. I learned that during my midnight inventories, someone had been watching me. Reporters started calling. Online threads collated screenshots. The narrative fissures were being filled by other people's assumptions. Adders fed on spectacle. I had to decide whether to let the story be written by clicks and cheap empathy, or to place my evidence where it could speak with authority. So I did something brutal and deliberate. I wrote the account, a calm, data-backed timeline. I uploaded the bank transfers, the deeds, the Meridian records, and I added a personal statement that was only as long as it needed to be. No melodrama, no begging. Just dates, numbers, and context. I hit publish. The effect was immediate. Journalists called. Online buzzing turned into articles. The narrative shifted from bride ruined to family fraud uncovered. People who had originally cheered Sasha's tears began to see the receipts. Public opinion is fickle but grounded in evidence. The documents I'd shared held a new weight that gossip could not displace. And in the quiet after the posting, there was a new, sharper silence. My parents stopped pretending to speak to the truth. Instead, their voices turned to pleading, bargaining, small confessions. They called and left messages that echoed with the hollow of people who had only now realized what they'd gambled away. I listened to one voicemail from my father and heard age and fear where I expected shamelessness. For a moment, a different question emerged. You can punish and still care, but at what cost? Momentum has a sound. The fast ping of emails, the escalating ring of phones, the click-clack of courtroom scheduling. The legal machinery moved with a bureaucratic precision that felt like both cold justice and necessary theater. Kinley pressed the prosecutor's office. Detective Rodriguez called to say the evidence was strong. People who had been anecdotal witnesses, the florist with unpaid invoices, the venue manager with cancellation notices, became next steps in a formal chain. There was a single, intimate moment before the courtroom where everything felt thin and luminous. I stood in the empty apartment I still legally owned, the Meridian title intact, the sale voided but scarred. The books on the shelf looked smaller than in memory. The sofa seemed to have been designed for someone gentler. Kinley stood at my back like an anchor. "They underestimated you," she said. "They assumed you'd fold." I thought about all the quiet nights in cheap hotels, about the small domestic rituals I'd foregone in exchange for balance sheets. The truth, I had been buying my family silence and comfort. I had also been buying my own peace by avoiding the conversations that would have ended in fury. Were both choices wrong? A little. Were they human? Absolutely. Courtroom day arrived like a cold sunrise. Cameras clustered outside the dais and the hall filled with people who read scandal like a sport. Dad arrived pale and blunt. Mom's makeup betrayed panic. Sasha stormed in with a kind of righteous flame, as if anger could armor her. The prosecutor's opening was precise: forged signatures, a fraudulent sale, attempts at identity-based borrowing. She laid out a timeline, each document another knife. I watched my parents shift under the weight. For the first time, they were beneath the gaze that does not love them. Bureaucracy saw only facts and failure. My testimony was short and steady. I avoided theatricality because the documents made the drama unnecessary. I told the court how Meridian held the title, how payments were routed on their behalf, and how my family had used my absence to override consent. It was technical and intimate, a public translation of countless small betrayals. The judge asked a few clarifying questions. My parents, when given a chance, offered stammered defenses. "We thought we could manage things. The money was needed. We didn't mean for anything to go this far." Meanings warp in court. "We didn't mean" is not a mitigation when you sign another person's name. The judge's voice did not thunder. It was flat, measured. "Crime requires intent and action," she said. "The evidence suggests both." From the prosecution's table, printed bank statements and signed affidavits became a map of choices that led to this moment. Outside of legal consequences, there was collateral damage. Destiny, the wedding planner, filed suit for lost business. Vendors named unpaid invoices and breached contracts. Sasha's Instagram flamed with both sympathy and scorn. Once the public saw the receipts, the chorus shifted in tone. Xander's family retreated. He no longer wanted to be a witness in a drama that smelled of entitlement. The engagement imploded. There was a private, crushing scene when the bailiff led my parents out for a break. My mother grabbed my hand for a second, not an embrace, not an apology, only a brief grasp that tasted like regret. I pulled away before it could mean anything larger. People make gestures that imply absolution. Criminal justice is not about gestures. I felt neither triumph nor cruelty. I felt a long, brittle fatigue. In the judge's chambers, restitution was discussed as if money could fully account for the theft of trust. Orders were entered, sentencing discussed in framing language. There is an odd arithmetic to these things, payback measured in dollars, punishment measured in months. It felt insufficient. Justice rarely shapes into the emotional contours of what was broken. When the courtroom cleared, cameras swarmed. I offered a short statement about financial boundaries and the quiet abuses of entitlement that eat families from the inside. It landed with mixed responses. Some cheered, some called me cruel. The paradox struck me. Standing up for yourself often requires acts others will label heartless. The build to the climax had been a slow, surgical unweaving of a family mythology, the idea that closeness permits theft. I stood then at the courthouse steps and felt the city around me, a pulse of people moving on with their days. This was our reality refracted into the public record. Something had been lost that could not be replaced. Something had been reclaimed that could not be undone. Both statements were true. Clarity does not always equal closure. The courtroom's decision landed not as a single strike, but as a series of measured blows. My father was sentenced. My mother received a lesser term and probation. Restitution orders were entered. For some viewers, justice concluded with that sound of judicial finality. For me, the climax was more complicated. Sasha's outburst in the hallway had been an operatic shriek, rage, humiliation, a sense that the world had turned against her without mercy. She accused me of ruining everything, of being petty, cruel, unloving. Her language was brittle with entitlement. "You turned our life into a circus," she yelled. Her face was raw, grief painting its lines. I could have retaliated with a speech. I could have named each debt, each quiet transfer, each time I had quietly repaired a leak in their lives. Instead, I listened. For a moment, very brief and dangerous, I let the possibility of forgiving shadow me. Not because I wanted reunion, but because forgiveness is sometimes a weapon you wield for yourself. It unclenches the fist that holds the past. But compassion does not erase harm. The climax is an ethical pressure test. It forces you to choose what to value. I stood with the evidence and the public record. The judge's sentence did not surprise me, but the way her father's shoulders folded as the gavel fell did. He looked older, smaller. My mother sobbed with the sort of quiet that is not for public consumption. Her shoulders shook in silent rhythms. It was pitiful without being absolving. Public fallout was immediate. Reporters circled like gulls. Sasha's videos continued to trend, but the narrative had shifted. The receipts on social feeds leaned heavy. Comments alternated between vindication for me and pity for a family undone by its own greed. The media, always hungry, asked the simplified question, was Maya right? Simplified questions are easy to answer, but they don't always reach the truth. The most intense moment arrived the morning after the hearing, when Destiny, the wedding planner, confronted me outside a coffee shop. Her business was in ruins, vendors sued, liabilities accrued. She looked like someone who had been pulled into a storm she couldn't control. "You had every right," she said quietly. "But people are losing livelihoods." The human cost resonated in a way legal codes cannot quantify. I had cut the thread. She had been caught in the net. Another moment that felt like the fulcrum of the climax was a single voicemail from Xander. His voice was low and steady. "I had to walk. I couldn't accept what your family became." He didn't want to hurt Sasha. He wanted distance from broken ethics that felt hereditary. The ending of that relationship was not the gavel, but a quieter fracture. The future Sasha had pictured, celebrations, alliances, a family merged into new lives, evaporated. Sitting on my couch that night, the apartment around me anchored in light and dust motes, I considered the cost. The legal win had been absolute, the personal cost ambiguous. I had, by design, cut them off a wire they had been too clever to sever themselves. There was a hollow sound where devotion used to be. It echoed. And yet something in me had been repaired, a backbone I had been mollifying for years. I had set a limit and held it. The climax was messy, morally lit, and uncomfortable. I was both victor and casualty of my own resolve. The truth is, the hardest victories sometimes leave the deepest quiet. Freedom arrived as a strange, small thing, a quiet apartment belonging to someone who had been absent from the life it held. The doorman greeted me with a softness I had not expected. The place smelled faintly of my old coffee and the faint, unmistakable scent of a life not lived for other people. I ran my fingers along the spines of books I had left in haste. Each title sat like an ally. Kinley drove in with an air of companionable resignation. We did not need to talk much. She handed me a thermos and a small printed copy of the restitution order like an odd talisman. "You did the right thing," she said. Those words never land cleanly. They sit clasped in context. But I accepted them anyway. There were residual shards. Reporters called. Strangers sent messages of solidarity and scorn in equal measure. Sasha's GoFundMe to fight injustice collected a handful of small, embarrassed donations and a lot of ridicule. Friends I had not realized were friends reached out quietly. For every voice that said I was cruel, two said I was brave. The ratio did not matter. The convicting thing that kept returning in private was the echo of my father's last plea in the family voicemail, a quiet, breaking sound that felt like exhaustion and old regrets. You can hold people accountable and still notice their human ugliness. The decision to press charges was not purely vindictive. It was a choice about who I would allow myself to be in the future, the patient solvent, the anonymous savior, or the person who names harm when it occurs. Packing a small bag that afternoon felt symbolic. I had thought I would throw a party in my empty apartment to celebrate the reclamation of property. Instead, I sat on the couch and thumbed through old messages, birthday texts, petitions for help, the lazy comforts of shared jokes. Deleting my parents' numbers felt like cutting cords, necessary and final. I saved one emergency contact, Kinley, and removed the rest. When I sold the apartment a month later, it wasn't spite, it was relocation. I signed the paperwork with a hand steadier than I expected. This building contained evidence of a life I had survived, but did not need to keep. New walls, new light, maybe Singapore again, maybe a small coastal city with a market and a cafe where I could read without thinking about ledgers. The move was an emptying and a promise. News cycles softening, reporters moved on. Other victims surfaced, stories of adult children whose parents had tapped identity, of caretakers who'd become unpaid bankers. Some contacted me, sending notes like life rafts. Thank you. The case echoed beyond our family. It opened conversations about financial boundaries and emotional entitlement. That felt like a legacy I could tolerate. The last scene lingered in the small of an afternoon when Kinley and I sat on a bench near a river that swallowed light. Children fed birds, a couple argued gently in a language I did not speak. I thought of the bridges I had burned and the bridges I had kept. The ones that matter are not systemic. They are the people who show up when your legal scaffolding collapses. If the end is a place of closure, then mine was a quiet, uneven closure. I left a family that had been my origin story. I did not know if I would ever return as more than a memory they'd explain to strangers. I lived with that. Liberation can be lonely. Freedom can be expensive. But the final, small truth settled into my chest like a coin. I would no longer be stone for others to carve. I had tested the edges of patience and legal fire and found a self willing to be seen, flawed and whole. The road ahead promised orphan nights and awkward birthdays and, perhaps, the slow, steady accrual of a life that was mine to spend. A month later, I received an odd envelope, a postcard from my mother with a short line, "I'm sorry." It did not change the verdict or erase the months. But I kept the card in a drawer anyway, folded between plain tickets and old receipts. Sometimes apology is a small beginning. Sometimes it is not. I slept that night without hearing a phone ring. The silence was not emptiness. It was the room where I would build myself anew.